The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned with deceptive tranquility over Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat in his private study at the White House, reviewing intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of global affairs. The war in Europe raged on, with Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht advancing across the Soviet Union, while in the Pacific, Emperor Hirohito's forces continued their aggressive expansion across China and Southeast Asia. Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel stood on the deck of his flagship at Pearl Harbor, watching the sun rise over the Pacific Fleet. The massive naval base hummed with routine Sunday morning activity, sailors attending church services, others writing letters home, many simply enjoying the Hawaiian sunshine. 8 battleships of the Pacific Fleet's battle force sat moored along Battleship Row like sleeping giants. The USS Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Roosevelt had spent months walking a political tightrope, providing aid to Britain through the Lend-Lease Act while maintaining America's official neutrality. The isolationist sentiment that had gripped the nation since the Great War remained strong, with powerful voices in Congress arguing that America should focus on its own problems rather than Europe's conflicts. Yet intelligence reports suggested that war might be inevitable. Lieutenant General Walter Campbell Short, commanding general of the Hawaiian Department, had implemented what he believed to be adequate defensive measures. Aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields to prevent sabotage, and radar stations operated on limited schedules to conserve equipment. The possibility of attack seemed remote. Pearl Harbor was considered the most secure naval installation in the Pacific. As referenced in declassified military archives from the National Security Agency, American cryptographers had been intercepting and decoding Japanese diplomatic communications through a program codenamed MAGIC. These intercepts revealed growing tensions, but provided no specific warning of the impending assault on Pearl Harbor. At 19 minutes past 6 that morning, the Japanese First Air Fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagamo, launched its first wave of attack aircraft from 6 aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles north of Oahu. 183 planes, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers began their deadly approach toward the unsuspecting American naval base. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the aerial armada, his heart pounding with anticipation as the Hawaiian coast came into view. Below them lay the prize that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had identified as crucial to Japanese expansion in the Pacific, the American Pacific Fleet. The plan was audacious and meticulously crafted: strike hard, strike fast, and cripple America's naval capability before the sleeping giant could fully awaken. Roosevelt remained unaware of the approaching doom as he prepared for what he assumed would be another quiet Sunday. His naval aide had briefed him on routine Pacific Fleet activities, and nothing in the morning intelligence summaries suggested imminent danger. The president planned to spend the day reviewing draft speeches and meeting with advisors about America's continued support for the Allied cause. The stage was set for a catastrophe that would transform not only Roosevelt's presidency, but the entire trajectory of American history. In less than 2 hours, the peaceful morning would erupt into chaos, forcing a reluctant nation into the greatest conflict the world had ever known. At 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time, the tranquil Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor shattered into chaos. Commander Fuchida's voice crackled over the radio frequencies. "Tora! Tora! Tora!" The predetermined code signaling that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. The first wave of Japanese aircraft descended upon the naval base like harbingers of doom. Torpedo bombers screamed in low over the harbor, their deadly cargo aimed at the massive battleships moored along Battleship Row. The USS Oklahoma took the first devastating hits, 4 torpedoes ripping through her port side in rapid succession. The mighty warship began listing immediately, her crew scrambling desperately as she rolled toward capsizing. Simultaneously, dive bombers plummeted from above, their engines howling as they released armor-piercing bombs converted from naval artillery shells. The USS Arizona became their primary target, and at 8:06 a.m., a catastrophic explosion erupted from her forward magazine. The blast lifted the entire forward section of the battleship, killing 1,177 sailors and Marines instantly. The Arizona settled to the harbor bottom, taking with her the lives of America's sons. Across the base, confusion reigned supreme. Sailors and soldiers, many still in their Sunday uniforms or sleeping clothes, rushed to battle stations as sirens wailed and explosions thundered across the harbor. Machine gun fire strafed personnel attempting to reach anti-aircraft positions, while bombs targeted aircraft lined up on nearby airfields. At Hickam Field, Captain Rasmussen led his men in a desperate attempt to get aircraft airborne, but the Japanese had achieved their objective of catching the Americans completely unprepared. Planes exploded on the ground, their fuel tanks creating secondary fires that spread across the tarmac like liquid death. The USS West Virginia absorbed multiple torpedo and bomb hits, settling onto the harbor bottom but remaining upright thanks to heroic counter-flooding efforts by her crew. Nearby, the USS California fought a losing battle against flooding as her watertight integrity failed under the relentless assault. Admiral Kimmel watched the destruction from his headquarters, his face pale with shock and growing rage. The man, responsible for defending America's Pacific stronghold, realized he was witnessing the most successful surprise attack in naval history. Radio communications buzzed with frantic damage reports and desperate calls for medical assistance. At 8:40 a.m., the second wave arrived. 170 additional Japanese aircraft, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, continued the devastation. They focused on ships that had survived the initial assault and targeted repair facilities, fuel storage tanks, and any remaining aircraft. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a magnet for the second wave. Determined to prevent her from escaping to open water where she might beach herself and block the harbor entrance, Japanese pilots concentrated their attacks on the moving battleship. Bombs rained down on her decks as she fought valiantly to reach safety. Heroism emerged from the chaos as individual Americans rose to meet the crisis. Petty Officer Doris Miller, an African-American cook aboard the West Virginia, manned a .50 caliber machine gun, despite having no formal training on the weapon, shooting at attacking aircraft until ordered to abandon ship. His courage would later earn him the Navy Cross. At Wheeler Field, Second Lieutenant George Welch and Kenneth Taylor managed to reach their P-40 fighters and engage the attackers, shooting down several Japanese aircraft in desperate aerial combat. Their actions provided one of the few bright spots in an otherwise devastating morning. By 10 a.m., the attack was over. The Japanese had achieved tactical success beyond their wildest expectations, but they had also awakened something far more dangerous than they realized: the full industrial and military might of the United States of America. At approximately 1:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, President Roosevelt was having lunch in his study when Navy Secretary Frank Knox burst through the doors, his face ashen with shock and disbelief. "Mr. President," Knox stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, "Pearl Harbor has been attacked by the Japanese Navy. The damage appears to be severe." Roosevelt's fork clattered to his plate as the words sank in. For a moment, the President of the United States sat in stunned silence, his mind racing to comprehend the implications of what he had just heard. The attack he had long feared but hoped might never come had finally materialized, and with it, America's reluctant entry into global warfare. "Get me Admiral Stark immediately," Roosevelt commanded, his voice regaining its characteristic authority despite the shock. Chief of Naval Operations, Harold Rainsford Stark, was summoned to provide detailed reports as they became available from Hawaii. The president's study quickly transformed into an impromptu war room as military leaders and cabinet members arrived throughout the afternoon. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had been scheduled to meet with Japanese Ambassador Kichi Saburo, Nomura, and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu at 2:15 p.m. that same day. The Japanese diplomats arrived carrying what they claimed was their government's final response to American demands regarding Japan's expansion in Southeast Asia. Hull read their 14-part message, which essentially rejected all American proposals and broke off diplomatic negotiations. When Hull finished reading, his face flushed with righteous anger. He looked directly at the Japanese representatives and delivered words that would echo through history. "In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions. The Japanese diplomats left the State Department in silence, their mission complete. As referenced in historical records from the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library, initial reports from Pearl Harbor painted a devastating picture. Radio communications from Admiral Kimmel's headquarters reported multiple battleships sunk or severely damaged, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, and casualty estimates climbing by the hour. Roosevelt immediately convened his cabinet for an emergency session. The room filled with the nation's top leaders, their faces grave as they absorbed the magnitude of the crisis. Secretary of War Henry Louis Stimson arrived with preliminary damage assessments, while Hull provided details of his confrontation with the Japanese envoys. "Gentlemen," Roosevelt began, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "we are now faced with the decision that history has forced upon us. The Japanese have chosen war, and we must respond accordingly." The president's advisors nodded grimly, understanding that this moment would define not only their administration, but America's role in the world for generations to come. Throughout the afternoon, reports continued arriving from Hawaii. The USS Arizona was confirmed as a total loss, her magazine explosion having created one of the most devastating single incidents in American naval history. The Oklahoma had capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors inside her hull. The West Virginia and California had settled to the harbor bottom, while the Nevada had managed to beach herself to prevent sinking in deep water. By evening, the scope of American losses became clearer. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed, along with numerous cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliaries. More than 300 aircraft had been eliminated, most before they could even take off. Most tragically, over 2,400 Americans had perished, with another 1,000 wounded. Roosevelt spent the evening crafting what would become one of the most important speeches in American history. He knew that the address he would deliver to Congress the following day must rally a shocked nation to war, while clearly establishing the moral justification for America's entry into global conflict. As night fell over Washington, the president prepared to transform from a leader trying to keep America out of war into a commander-in-chief mobilizing the nation for total victory. December 8, 1941, dawned gray and somber over the nation's capital. President Roosevelt had worked through much of the night, carefully crafting the speech that would ask Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. His secretary, Grace Tully, had typed multiple drafts as the president refined his words, understanding that this address would be remembered for generations. At 12:30 p.m., Roosevelt's motorcade departed the White House for the Capitol building. The president, wearing a dark suit and his familiar cape, sat solemnly in his car as crowds of Americans lined the streets. Many held newspapers with screaming headlines about the Pearl Harbor attack, their faces reflecting the mixture of shock, anger, and determination that had gripped the nation overnight. The House chamber filled to capacity as senators, representatives, cabinet members, and Supreme Court justices took their seats for this historic joint session of Congress. In the gallery above, Eleanor Roosevelt sat with distinguished guests, her own expression reflecting the gravity of the moment. The tension in the chamber was palpable, as everyone understood they were witnessing a pivotal moment in American history. At precisely 12:29 p.m., Roosevelt entered the chamber, supported by his son James, who wore his Marine Corps uniform. The president's physical disability, carefully concealed from the public throughout his presidency, became irrelevant in this moment of national crisis. His moral authority and leadership were what mattered now. As Roosevelt approached the podium, the chamber erupted in sustained applause. Democrats and Republicans alike rose to their feet, political divisions temporarily set aside in the face of national emergency. The president acknowledged the ovation with a slight nod, then began the speech that would echo through history. Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt's voice carried clearly through the chamber and across radio waves to millions of Americans listening at home, in offices, and gathered around public loudspeakers. His measured cadence emphasized each word as he detailed the treachery of the Japanese attack while American diplomats were still engaged in peace negotiations. The president methodically outlined the scope of Japanese aggression, mentioning attacks not only on Pearl Harbor, but also on Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippine Islands, Wake Island, and Midway Island. He painted a picture of coordinated Japanese expansion across the Pacific, making clear that Pearl Harbor was part of a larger strategy of conquest. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory, Roosevelt declared, his voice rising with conviction. The chamber erupted again as congressmen and senators leaped to their feet, applauding with fierce determination. Senator Arthur Hendrick Vandenberg, previously one of the leading isolationist voices in Congress, sat with tears in his eyes. The Michigan Republican realized that his long-held beliefs about American neutrality had died with the sailors at Pearl Harbor. Isolationism was no longer tenable when enemies brought war to American shores. Roosevelt's speech lasted only 6 minutes, but those words transformed America from a reluctant observer of global conflict into an active belligerent committed to total victory. The president concluded with his formal request. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Senate voted 82-0 in favor of war, while the House approved the declaration 388-1. The single dissenting vote came from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who had also voted against American entry into the Great War. Within hours of Roosevelt's speech, similar declarations followed against Germany and Italy after those nations honored their Axis obligations and declared war on the United States. America had officially entered World War II, and the industrial giant that Japan had hoped to cripple was instead awakening to its full potential. The days following, Roosevelt's declaration of war witnessed the most rapid military mobilization in American history. The president understood that transforming America from a peacetime democracy into what he would later call the arsenal of democracy required unprecedented coordination between government, industry, and the American people themselves. Within 72 hours of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had established the War Production Board under the leadership of Donald Marr Nelson, former executive vice president of Sears Roebuck. Nelson's mandate was staggering: convert American manufacturing from consumer goods to military equipment faster than any nation had ever accomplished. Automobile plants would build tanks and aircraft engines, while refrigerator factories would produce ammunition and weapons. The president's closest advisor, Harry Lloyd Hopkins, coordinated with military leaders to establish production priorities. Admiral Ernest Joseph King, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, demanded immediate expansion of naval construction. General George Catlett Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, required massive increases in small arms, artillery, and vehicle production to equip the millions of soldiers America would need to train. Roosevelt's fireside chat on December 9th reached the largest radio audience in American history. An estimated 60 million Americans gathered around their radios as the president explained the challenges ahead. We are now in this war. We are all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history. The response from American industry exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Henry Ford, despite his previous isolationist sympathies, committed his massive River Rouge plant to B-24 bomber production. Kaiser Shipbuilding revolutionized naval construction with assembly line techniques that reduced Liberty ship construction time from months to days. Boeing, Consolidated Aircraft, and other manufacturers expanded production capacity at unprecedented rates. Roosevelt established the Office of Price Administration under Leon Henderson to prevent inflation from crippling the economy. Rationing programs began almost immediately, with Americans accepting restrictions on gasoline, rubber, metals, and food items. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards across the nation as citizens contributed to the war effort on the home front. The president also faced the enormous challenge of expanding America's armed forces from fewer than 2 million personnel to what would eventually become over 16 million men and women in uniform. The Selective Service System, under General Lewis Blaine Hershey, registered millions of young Americans for military service. Training camps that had been hastily constructed during the pre-war military buildup now expanded exponentially. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American and Filipino forces in the Philippines, sent increasingly desperate messages requesting reinforcements as Japanese forces advanced through the archipelago. Roosevelt and his military advisors made the painful decision that Europe must take priority, leaving MacArthur's forces to conduct a fighting withdrawal that would culminate in the Bataan Death March. As documented in wartime production records from the National Archives, American industrial output during 1942 increased by over 30% compared to pre-war levels. This expansion continued throughout the conflict, ultimately producing the ships, planes, tanks, and weapons that would equip not only American forces, but also Allied armies around the globe. Roosevelt understood that winning the war required more than industrial production. It demanded maintaining American morale and unity. Hollywood studios were encouraged to produce films supporting the war effort, while the Office of War Information coordinated propaganda campaigns. Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms paintings, inspired by Roosevelt's famous speech, became iconic symbols of American war aims. The president also grappled with one of the most controversial decisions of his presidency, the internment of Japanese Americans. Pressure from military leaders on the West Coast, combined with public hysteria following Pearl Harbor, led to Executive Order 9066 in February 1942. Over 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were relocated to internment camps, a decision that would later be recognized as one of the darkest chapters in wartime America. By the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor, America had become unrecognizable from the nation that had been attacked 1 year earlier. Industrial production had doubled, millions of Americans were in uniform, and the United States had become the primary supplier of military equipment for Allied forces worldwide. Roosevelt's transformation from reluctant neutral to wartime commander-in-chief was complete. 1 year after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt stood again before a joint session of Congress, but this time to deliver his State of the Union address for 1943. The America he addressed bore little resemblance to the nation that had been shocked into war 12 months earlier. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared to awaken was now fully roused and demonstrating its awesome industrial and military potential. The statistics Roosevelt cited that day revealed the magnitude of American mobilization. Aircraft production had increased from less than 6,000 planes in 1941 to over 47,000 in 1942. Naval construction had expanded from fewer than 100 vessels to over 800. Most importantly, American forces were now engaged on multiple fronts, from the Solomon Islands in the Pacific to North Africa in the Mediterranean. General Dwight David Eisenhower, commanding American forces in the European theater, reported directly to Roosevelt on plans for the invasion of Sicily and eventually the Italian mainland. In the Pacific, Admiral Chester William Nimitz had rebuilt the Pacific Fleet from the ashes of Pearl Harbor, achieving decisive victories at the Coral Sea and Midway that had halted Japanese expansion and begun America's island-hopping campaign toward Japan itself. The president reflected privately on how completely Pearl Harbor had transformed not only American foreign policy, but his own presidency. The man who had campaigned in 1940 on keeping America out of foreign wars had become the architect of global victory. Roosevelt's leadership during the crisis had validated American democracy's ability to respond effectively to existential threats. MacArthur's forces, reinforced after their painful retreat from the Philippines, were now advancing through New Guinea and preparing for their promised return to the Philippines. The general's famous declaration, "I shall return," had become a rallying cry for American forces throughout the Pacific theater. Roosevelt, despite personal friction with MacArthur's publicity-seeking nature, recognized the strategic value of the general's dramatic leadership style. At home, American society had been fundamentally altered by the war effort. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter imagery that appeared on factory walls across the nation. African Americans found new opportunities in defense industries, leading to the Double V campaign that linked victory abroad with civil rights progress at home. Roosevelt's alliance with Winston Spencer Churchill and Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin had created the Grand Alliance that was systematically dismantling the Axis powers. The president's diplomatic skills, honed through years of domestic political battles, proved equally effective in managing the complex relationships between Allied leaders with vastly different political systems and war aims. The economic transformation had been equally dramatic. Unemployment, which had plagued America throughout the Great Depression, had essentially disappeared as defense industries absorbed every available worker. Government spending had increased exponentially, validating Keynesian economic theories about the stimulative effects of deficit spending during national emergencies. As referenced in post-war economic analyses from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the war years saw the creation of the modern military-industrial complex that would define American economic and foreign policy for decades to come. Companies like Boeing, Lockheed, and General Dynamics became permanent fixtures in American defense production. On December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after the attack, Roosevelt participated in a solemn ceremony at Pearl Harbor via radio link. The president's voice carried across the Pacific to honor the 2,403 Americans who had died that Sunday morning. The USS Arizona, still resting on the harbor bottom, had become a national shrine to American sacrifice and determination. Pearl Harbor had achieved the opposite of what Japanese planners intended. Rather than crippling American naval power and forcing a negotiated peace, the attack had unleashed the full productive capacity of American industry and the righteous anger of the American people. Roosevelt's leadership during those crucial first hours and days had channeled national shock into focused determination for total victory. The president who had once hoped to keep America out of war had become the commander-in-chief who would lead the nation to complete triumph over fascism. Pearl Harbor had transformed Franklin Delano Roosevelt from a domestic reform president into one of history's great wartime leaders, proving that sometimes the most reluctant warriors become the most effective commanders when their cause is just and their nation's survival is at stake.